pursuit of truth, in the absence of empirical evidence or impartial justice, inevitably becomes a spiritual undertaking. Before the age of written record, before the invention of objective skepticism, the concept of guilt was not an academic matter. It was a profound violation against the divine order itself. How do you prove that a man speaks truly, or indeed that he has committed no sin, when all we have are words easily twisted by fear, greed, and misunderstanding? The answer, according to the deepest cultural currents of the medieval world, lay not in testimony alone, but in the body itself. It was through ritualized physical endurance, through pain itself, that one could extract definitive proof of spiritual purity. To swear an oath was not merely a promise, it was a covenant with powers far older and far less forgiving than any royal decree. And when that oath concerned land, life, or honor, the stakes were absolute. The belief system was thus elegantly self-reinforcing. If your very soul was pure, the gods would vouch for you, even under duress. Therefore, suspicion could not simply result in arrest. It demanded a crucible. Ordeal became less of a punishment and more of a misguided scientific experiment into the nature of sin itself. These were not mere suggestions of judicial procedure. They were established metaphysical protocols. The logic behind them was stunningly circular, yet utterly compelling to those who lived within that framework. Imagine a man accused of trespassing upon sacred land, or perhaps suspected of keeping unauthorized knowledge, a heresy against the communal spirit. Simply accepting his word might have seemed insufficient in modern times, but in medieval courts, words were porous things, easily contaminated by rumor and malice. A physical oath, conversely, was seen as something incorruptible, a direct channeling of divine truth through biological response to stress. When the law demanded proof beyond reasonable doubt, the medieval mind interpreted reasonable not through logic, but through celestial intervention. The ordeal suggested that God himself would step into the courtroom, not merely as an observer, but as an active judge whose favor was measurable by physical outcome. This divine judgment operated on a simplified binary scale, pure or guilty. There was no spectrum of moral ambiguity, only two stark outcomes, and the mechanism for determining which required visceral engagement with danger. Consider the ordeal involving heated substances. These methods were designed to test endurance against predictable, yet agonizing, stimuli. The act was fundamentally one of faith, dressed in the uniform of jurisprudence. It presumed that a truly blameless individual would withstand not only the pain, but also its specific spiritual resonance. Whether it was boiling water, allowing certain injuries to fester, and subsequently healing miraculously, or passing through direct physical punishment, each method held a distinct theory of spiritual stress. The intent was never simply to inflict suffering. The suffering itself was viewed as a purifying agent. It was an attempt at self-diagnosis on a societal scale. If the pain did not kill, and if certain physiological responses defied immediate explanation, it signaled divine grace. It proved, in a profoundly literal sense, that one had been spared the worst judgment. This perspective is jarring to us now, divorced from its deep cultural moorings. We view these practices with what we instinctively label as horror or absurdity, but for those who stood within the logic of the time, they were not barbaric. They were rigorous and scientifically sound in a theological sense. They represented the highest form of jurisprudence, a commitment to absolute truth at any cost to human comfort or modern sensibility. The implications of believing that God would settle disputes with boiling water cannot be overstated. It speaks to a civilization grappling intensely with foundational existential questions, asking, how do we know what is true? And if we cannot observe objective fact, must the answer therefore come from the transcendent? It was in this vacuum of observable certainty that these painful rituals found their powerful foothold. They transformed mere accusation into sacramental performance. The accused man did not merely stand trial. He underwent a rite of spiritual cleansing before the community could safely move forward. His endurance became a physical testament to his inherent worthiness. This system thus created an entirely closed, self-validating reality for those who governed it, establishing that ultimate authority resided not in human statute books alone, but in divinely witnessed suffering. The law was therefore intertwined with theology, and the physical body became the primary site of legal confrontation. To fail, the ordeal meant accepting the most terrible fate, a consequence understood by all participants, a public acknowledgement of divine condemnation. Success offered not merely freedom, but an elevated status within the social fabric, validating one's place in the cosmic order. It was an exchange of pain for peace, and the currency was always spiritual purity. Before ink could record nuanced testimony or complex legal precedent, the blood, sweat, and tears were required to validate every conviction, making suffering not merely a consequence of guilt, but the very prerequisite for defining innocence itself. If the first ordeal established that divine judgment was required to discern truth, then the subsequent ordeals were simply specialized applications of this principle. The law was not merely a system of rules. It was an attempt to manage chaos, and in their belief structure, only divine intervention could achieve true order. When physical evidence failed, when the oath swore by water proved ambiguous or inconclusive, the authority gravitated toward methods that claimed direct access to supernatural confirmation: fire, metal, and heat. The hot iron theory suggests a fascinating blend of metallurgy, theology, and deep-seated cultural paranoia. It did not assume malice. It presumed pure spiritual consequence. The core idea was simple yet terrifyingly effective in its context. The body acted as an antenna, and intense physical suffering served as the conductor for divine clarity. A superficial burn, an inspection by heated metal, these were never undertaken with the goal of maximizing agony. Rather, they were perceived to be ritualistic examinations designed to reveal whether the individual's soul was compatible with truth. The pain itself was secondary to the purported medical or spiritual result. Consider the blacksmith's workshop. This was a place where fire and reshaping metals were daily realities, where immense heat transformed soft ore into rigid tools of justice. To transplant those elemental forces, the hammer blow, the searing glow, the enduring resistance of flesh, into the judicial process, lent an air of brutal rationality to what we now understand as sheer cruelty. The metal was seen not just as an instrument of pain, but as a conduit for divine judgment itself. The procedure itself required a meticulous detachment that modern viewers find deeply disturbing, yet which must be appreciated as part of its unique cultural logic. The goal was rarely fatal, rather, it sought confirmation of purity, a mark left by heated iron, a controlled burn on the skin. These were intended to be lasting signs, physical scars that served as permanent documentation within the community's moral ledger. If the brand healed cleanly and swiftly, if the wound revealed no lingering corruption, this was taken as proof of divine blessing and innocence. If it festered, if the flesh seemed reluctant or patchy, then the spiritual stain was presumed to be equally evident. It is a chillingly complex system because it demands that all participants, the accused, the accuser, the judge, and even the torturer, suspend their modern understanding of bodily integrity in favor of an ancient metaphysics. The pain becomes evidence. The scar becomes testimonial. This transforms the human body from something inherently private to something public, perpetually subject to state-sanctioned investigation by flame and tongs. They were not merely punishing a crime, they were ritually excising the moral failing, brandishing the imperfection for all society to see. The academic fascination here lies in recognizing this systemic coherence. Within its own framework of belief, the hot iron method was entirely rational. It addressed the problem of establishing truth when written law failed and mere oaths proved fallible. If God had to speak, and God spoke through fire and metal, then the procedure followed necessarily held religious weight. The discomforting reality is that this process relied fundamentally on a powerful, beautiful misunderstanding, a deep conviction in the curative power of trauma. It was an early form of psychohistory, masquerading as sacred science, where suffering was not merely endured, but actively leveraged to construct a narrative of guilt or grace. By accepting the pain as a legitimate investigative tool. They created a self-sealing structure of justice, one that could only be overturned by divine whim, or perhaps simply time and modern skepticism. The heat did not just burn, it forged belief into solid, indelible fact. If the oath could fail, if the heat could not prove purity, then where did the law find its grip? The investigation must inevitably move away from the ethereal and toward the thoroughly mundane. No longer were we discussing divinely sanctioned suffering. Instead, we navigated the treacherous landscape of daily life, the farmer avoiding the rent collector, the merchant pocketing an extra coin, the weaver undercounting his bales. Crime, at this level, was less a moral failing than a simple failure of arithmetic, and its correction demanded equally complex, if far stranger, punitive mechanisms. The law viewed these minor fiscal transgressions not merely as theft, but as an offense against community stability itself. It was the violation of the shared, invisible covenant that allowed people to simply coexist, to plant seeds, trade goods, and survive another harsh winter. And the punishment for such a fundamental rupture of civic trust had to achieve something beyond simple compensation. It had to be inherently visible, utterly unforgettable, and deeply embarrassing. This brings us to what historians sometimes term the shame economy. It is not the cold certainty of physical pain that defines this chapter, but rather the calculated discomfort of public visibility. The lawmaker understood an ancient, primal truth, that for a society based on reputation, a system where your worth was defined by your neighbors' whispers and glances, the deepest fear was not death, but irrelevance. Consider the tax evasion case. A man or woman who failed to pay their tithe, or who skimmed from the guild's collective fund, committed an act of financial deceit. The magistrate, armed with less of verdict and more theatrical intention, understood that mere fines were insufficient. He needed something that would etch the crime not just into ledgers, but onto the very body and public memory of the transgressor. The solution, often delivered by local authorities or guild masters eager to preserve social order, was exquisite in its absurdity. Punishment through engineered humiliation. This required a shift from the high drama of the ordeal, the grand, spiritual transaction, to the deeply practical, almost theatrical misdemeanor court. One particularly strange and enduring example involves the use of pigments, specifically pink. Pink wasn't merely decorative, it was symbolic. It signaled deviation, a visual warning painted onto a flesh that was supposed to signal conformity. In some locales, tax defaulters, or those accused of low-level fraud, were required to undergo temporary branding or markings, using these vivid, highly visible powders. The resulting patches of pink pigment served as walking billboards, declaring the wearer's social debt and professional stain for all to observe. The goal was profoundly behavioral, a gentle, nagging pressure that convinced the individual that their survival, reputation included, depended entirely on rectifying the error in front of their community. It wasn't about hurting them. It was about making them conspicuous, inconveniently visible until they paid what they owed and resumed their proper place within the collective economic fabric. But the shame economy developed a capacity for far grander, indeed stranger, performance art. Sometimes, especially when dealing with those who were economically useless or deemed dangerously non-compliant, such as specific groups of porters, traveling entertainers, or marginalized agricultural workers, the punishment was not just pigmentation. It escalated to literal behavioral modification. We find evidence of the practice of pigging, the public branding, or mandatory use of pigs. This is a profoundly uncomfortable subject to explore with the requested detached academic curiosity. Yet, it serves as an unparalleled historical marker of how deeply pragmatic and absurd medieval social control could become. The pig, in this context, was not a creature of husbandry. It was a living signifier of economic negligence. The branding or forced public handling of livestock, particularly pigs, for failing to pay taxes or services rendered, stripped the individual of their human dignity and recast them within the animal economy. They were shown that they had forfeited their place in sophisticated human commerce. Their worth was literally equated with the lowest tier of productive labor. The visual impact was overwhelming. A respected craftsman who yesterday commanded high wages, today might be forced to wear crude attire, or even serve as a public advertisement for his debt. Much like a stray animal meant to evoke pity and correction simultaneously. The spectacle functioned not just as punishment, but as an immediate, visible deterrent to all who watched. The underlying philosophical framework here is chillingly coherent. The deepest social law was the invisible agreement that everyone knew where they stood, that they were both worthy of community and vulnerable to communal censure. These penalties ensured visibility. They forced a level of self-policing unparalleled by later, more bureaucratic forms of governance. The stain wasn't just on their conscience. It was literally painted onto their skin, visible under the harsh midday sun. The pink pigment suggested sinfulness, while the pig implied commodity status. Together, they formed a potent synergy of social death. The shame economy understood that sometimes the most effective cage is not made of iron bars, but of collective gaze. It demanded adherence to local norms, the predictable exchange of coin for toil or produce for grain. And failure was met not with divine reckoning, but with a meticulously crafted, profoundly inconvenient civic embarrassment that left scars far deeper and more lasting than any superficial burn. It demonstrates how human legal and social structures are often less concerned with absolute moral truth, the domain of the priest, and far more invested in maintaining operational efficiency. A society needs its mechanics to run smoothly. It needs tax revenue, stable food supplies, and legible hierarchies. The body became, therefore, a filing cabinet for civic misdeeds, and the law, an expert tattoo artist at making those records permanently visible. The village dinner table, a scene of domestic warmth and routine, or so it appeared to the modern eye. But in this corner of history, a simple meal was rarely just sustenance. It was a tribunal. By all appearances, it was an act of conviviality, a shared loaf of bread, perhaps some spiced wine. Neighbors gathered over the detritus of the harvest. Yet, underneath the clinking of pewter and the murmur of gossip lay something far more unsettling: the architecture of guilt itself. This chapter examines a bizarrely intimate form of justice, the accusatory banquet. Here, law did not arrive in the guise of armored knights or judicial decrees, but it arrived with ladles, platters, and polite conversation. The crime was rarely committed alone. Often, it blossomed from whispers shared across generations, amplified by the perceived intimacy of a communal meal. The medieval mind, when confronted with suspicion, tended to locate the source not in grand conspiracies plotted far away, but right at their elbow. To know someone, to share bread and blood, was to assume an intimate knowledge of their soul, a vulnerability that could be mined for confessions. And thus, the banqueting table transformed from a place of comfort into the most effective confessional chamber imaginable. It was a psychological battlefield of extreme proximity. Consider the accused person. They sat amidst familiar faces, a neighbor who knew them since childhood, a cousin whose family had always stood beside theirs. The power dynamic here was devastatingly complex. Unlike facing a distant judge whose pronouncements were official and impersonal, the accusations at the banquet came from within the circle of trust. These weren't abstract laws. They were personalized betrayals, coded in the sticky glaze of forced companionship. The true crime often wasn't theft or outright murder, though those certainly occurred, but a failure of communal agreement. A perceived slight, an unfulfilled debt that went beyond simple coin, a breach of unspoken familial code, could trigger this entire horrifying mechanism. The suspicion was contagious, passed like the scent of good roast meat and strong liquor. Guilt became something deeply social, residing not in the criminal's private heart, but in the shared atmosphere of the meal itself. And how did one extract truth from such a tightly packed setting? Through suggestion, affirmation, and the careful orchestration of group dynamics. If 3 people pointed to a single individual at their dinner table and nodded gravely, even if they had nothing concrete to prove, the weight of that consensus became devastating evidence. The collective gaze was more powerful than any heated iron or sacred oath. It suggested that perhaps the accused was subtly contaminating the very fabric of the community's harmony. Their presence rendered the shared bounty somehow diminished. The accusers themselves were masters of the art of polite psychological dismantling. They did not need to shout. A low, empathetic murmur delivered with the sincerity of worried concern proved far more effective. They would begin by recounting anecdotes, stories designed subtly, but surely to paint the accused in a damning light. The victim might be portrayed as suddenly distant, overly ambitious, or possessing an unnerving silence when prompted about past slights. By weaving these narratives into the shared discourse, a conversation about whether planting yields or the poor fishing season, the accusations became indistinguishable from simple gossip. The accuser functioned less like a prosecutor and more like an overzealous storyteller who was determined to make the central character's flaws the dramatic climax. They were creating not evidence for a court, but consensus among their peers. The conviction was therefore community-sourced, immediate, and utterly overwhelming because it felt natural. It simply was true within the social contract of that particular evening. This method exploited a fundamental human need, belonging, to be excluded from the dinner table, to be questioned by one's own kin under the watchful eye of neighbors. That was to face a form of exile far worse than any physical punishment. The accused person was caught in a devastating trap where their reputation, their entire economic and social value, hung suspended over a pot of stew. They were forced into an increasingly cornered position, needing only a single slip of the tongue, or perhaps just silence, to seal their doom. The banqueting table thus became the ultimate stage for moral performance. Everyone, the guests, the accusers, and the accused were performing roles. Loyal neighbor, careful host, struggling suspect. And in that highly charged theatrical environment, the truth was irrelevant. What mattered was the satisfying resolution of social tension. The collective need to restore harmony outweighed any demand for objective justice. The system worked because it provided a rapid, emotionally satisfying narrative closure to communal stress. The consequences of this performative injustice were profound and varied. They could result in public penance, mandatory labor on community land, or sometimes nothing at all, leaving the accused permanently marked by suspicion, an invisible social stain no law could erase. It taught the medieval world a chilling lesson. That reputation was not merely what you were. It was something fragile, flammable, and utterly dependent upon the goodwill of those who sat next to you when the wine flowed and the bread was warm. It shows us that even in moments meant to be joyous, the celebration of a harvest, or simply an ordinary week's supper, there lay always the potential for profound moral violence. The dinner table, once seen as the apex of civilized comfort, emerges instead as a chillingly effective instrument for social control and judicial terror. proving that sometimes the most sinister methods are not those involving chains and fire, but merely shared conversation and well-meaning gossip after the blinding flash of fire and the agonizing heat of the iron, where truth was supposedly scorched onto the skin. There were other methods less dramatic perhaps, but equally draining, systems of justice predicated not on immediate pain, but on prolonged anticipation or sheer endurance. If the body could not yield the confession, then the spirit must be drained through waiting itself. The ordeal by inaction arrived at a subtle, chilling zenith in medieval jurisprudence. It was the punishment of the slow creep, the gnawing emptiness of time unspent and clarity withheld. These trials understood that a person's mind, given enough nothingness, would become its own cruelest interrogator. The physical torment, while memorable, had a definite beginning and an undeniable end. It released itself into the ether like smoke. But to be held in stasis, to endure the slow passage of hours, days, even weeks, without certainty or relief, that was a torture far more insidious, operating purely on the architecture of hope. The theory suggested that human beings maintained an internal rhythm, a perceived trajectory toward resolution, and the legal system, with meticulous care and profound indifference, possessed the ability to shatter that rhythm entirely, confining an accused to a chamber, keeping them awake when sleep offered oblivion, or simply leaving them in a place of quiet expectation, was framed by the authorities not as incarceration, but as purification. It was believed that true enlightenment, the unveiling of spiritual clarity, could only be achieved through sustained deprivation and mental exhaustion. Consider the ritualized detention, being kept vigil until the will fractured. The accused was required to prove their innocence, not with an oath or a scar, but with sheer stamina. The body could fail them through collapse, but the spirit, it was assumed, would finally confess its secrets under the weight of relentless boredom and existential dread. The concept operated like a slow-release poison mixed with false hope. You were given just enough crumbs, a glimpse of an approaching official, the sudden arrival of another prisoner, the promise of parole by dawn to maintain your agonizing awareness, ensuring that the despair never fully settled into numbness. The goal was to convert mental alertness into physical decay. This extended judicial process found bizarre analogues in other forms of waiting. Think of those involved in divination practices or deep interrogation methods, where the accused was required to participate in a long, meandering rite, a trial by endurance. Whether they were forced to remain near a specific location until an oracle spoke, or kept under the watch of multiple officials whose shifting attention created a profound sense of unstable anticipation, the core mechanism remained consistent: time as weapon. The passing moments became palpable entities, heavy and accusatory. The medieval mind viewed this patience not merely as suffering, but as a prerequisite for understanding. If you could endure unbearable stillness, if you could stare into an empty courtyard and remain coherent despite your circumstances, it was argued that your soul must be profoundly pure. To fail, the endurance test meant not just guilt, but evidence of fundamental spiritual weakness. It implied a disordered mind, incapable of sustaining the divine contemplation required for acquittal. This slow burn judicial process required a unique kind of civic architecture, one built on meticulous record-keeping of absence. The system had to track the duration of discomfort, counting out minutes as units of moral degradation or purification. There was an entire bureaucratic subculture dedicated simply to managing waiting, to ensuring that the passage of time remained agonizingly noticeable for all involved. The legal authority wasn't just about what you did, but how long you had to wait before they decided if what you did mattered at all. The very act of indefinite suspension became a determinant factor in law itself. It was the ultimate bureaucratic power play, holding life on a leash defined by arbitrary schedules and fluctuating levels of attention. It is a chillingly rational system when viewed through the distorted lens of early modern psychology. If man cannot be forced to speak the truth through fire, nor can he be compelled by physical limitation, by chains or branded scars, then one must attack his most essential resource, his continuity of self. The denial of time's passage becomes an assault on sanity itself. The trial by Tortoise, in this context, is merely a metaphor for that drawn-out psychological agony. It suggests the agonizing slowness, the relentless, predetermined pace towards some inevitable and often unclear resolution. You are not awaiting a physical release. You are undergoing a spiritual attrition designed to reveal cracks in the facade of your will. The system was exquisitely structured to maximize melancholic exhaustion. And this is where the modern observer finds themselves utterly adrift, suspended between horrified recognition and detached academic curiosity. We see the sheer wastefulness of it all, the expenditure of human potential against a backdrop of existential dread. Yet, for them, within their own profoundly coherent legal universe, the lack of definitive physical pain was not an acquittal, but merely proof that you had survived another lesson in painful self-discovery. They believed that by stripping away time and certainty, they were, in fact, refining the soul, drawing out a truth so pure it was nearly unbearable to witness. It is a truly unsettling picture of human conviction, the belief that profound suffering, even if purely intellectual, could ultimately lead to enlightenment. It is tempting to view the mechanisms of medieval justice through a modern lens, assuming that every act of pain must correlate with measurable accountability. But perhaps this assumption misses the point entirely. The law, in its most sophisticated and enduring forms, was often not about punishment at all. It was about performance. It was a theatrical display designed to solidify the ruling class's power, while simultaneously reassuring the masses that order still existed, even if that order was predicated on blood and fear. We must pivot our attention from the victim's suffering to the administrator of the law itself, to the courtier, whose primary talent was not martial skill or honest labor, but the impeccable execution of injustice. The true masters of medieval justice were those who understood aesthetic value in cruelty. For them, the judicial process was a highly sophisticated craft, a curatorial arrangement of dread and decree. The lawyer, the judge, the court official, they all played roles that required not just legal knowledge, but an understanding of public spectacle. An accusation today must look weighty. It must be inscribed with gravity, even if the underlying evidence was merely gossip whispered over cheap wine. Consider the architecture of a medieval courtroom. It was never truly impartial. It was designed to overwhelm the senses. The high wooden beams meant to evoke heaven, but the dark recesses were perfect for secret dealings and whispered perjury. The very materials used in jurisprudence held symbolic power. The oiled oak table where oaths were sworn, the heavy gilt book upon which statutes were inscribed, the plumes of wax that dripped into small, ritualistic pools of smoke during deliberation. These elements formed a cohesive ecosystem of controlled dread. To participate in the law was to assume part of its beautiful, dreadful grandeur. If you were poor and accused, your fate might be sealed by a single man's flourish, with a quill pen, a gesture that cost nothing material, but carried infinite social weight. The sheer performance of legality became the ultimate determinant of truth. The courtier's skill was this ability to elevate bureaucracy into art. A tedious list of procedural motions, once recited aloud by a professional scribe, gained the dramatic power of prophecy. A simple act of documentation, the meticulously cross-referenced docket sheet, the sealed writ bearing an impressive, if forged, royal seal, became proof enough for guilt. The paperwork did not lie. It merely reflected the deeply flawed assumptions and desires of those who wrote it. This system was a beautiful paradox. The more complex the process, the less likely any single individual truly was to understand its inner workings. By making justice overwhelmingly complicated, the ruling class ensured that their own interpretation became canon law. The layperson could not challenge the logic of conflicting precedents. They could only endure the weight of incomprehension. It is in this realm, among the elegantly tailored robes and the heavy scent of expensive incense used to mask the smell of sweat and fear, that the true systemic power resided. The penalty for a minor crime might not be branding or boiling water. It might simply be the public designation of being unable to afford appropriate legal representation. This subtle economic maneuver was often more devastating than any physical torture. because it cut off the victim's ability to speak against the powerful. We are thus forced to reconsider where true sin lay in these societies. Was it merely tax evasion, or perhaps a failed negotiation? Was it simply telling an uncomfortable truth, or perhaps challenging the proper sequence of legal filings? The stakes were never purely physical. They were existential, a threat to one's place within the carefully constructed, aesthetically pleasing edifice of social belonging. The law, therefore, was not merely a mechanism for establishing guilt. It was a ritualistic confirmation of hierarchies. Every successful trial, every complex set of legal precedents cited, reaffirmed who had the right to wield power, and how beautiful that power looked when performed correctly. The justice system itself became an art form, one whose patrons were the wealthy elite, one whose medium was human desperation, and whose masterpiece was the perfect, undeniable illusion of order. And this is why it sometimes feels so disconcertingly cozy. Because at its core, it wasn't a brutal fight for survival. It was a polished performance designed to maintain the comfortable distance between the accuser and the accused, between the judge and the judged, all while maintaining the immaculate sheen of civilization itself. The scars tell the story in a language far older than ink and parchment. They are the definitive ledger of lives lived under an uncompromising, profoundly literal interpretation of law. If medieval life was defined by fear, then physical alteration was its ultimate currency. Before conviction could be finalized with a writ, it had to be written on the flesh itself. To bear a mark was not merely punishment, it was the permanent public record of one's transgression. It was an aesthetic condemnation, transforming the human body from a self-contained narrative into open exhibition space for communal judgment. This was justice made visible, enforced not by jail bars or shackles, but by the indelible cruelty of biology. Consider the simple, dreadful efficacy of branding. A patch of scorched skin that resisted healing enough to remain a pale, puckered souvenir. It was never just about inflicting pain. It was about attaching an identifying sign, a physical shaming motif that could not be removed, forgotten, or denied. This mark screamed failure across crowded market squares, declaring, in permanent anatomical terms, precisely who you were and what sin you had committed against both the community and God. But marks were not always simple brands of shame. Sometimes they were more specialized, more meticulous, a literal excision of the wrongdoing. The crime was so defined, the betrayal so deeply understood by the adjudicators, that the law seemed to require the removal of the physical source of the moral defect. It was an almost surgical diagnosis of the soul. The procedure itself must have been bafflingly intense. Imagine the ritual, the methodical preparation, the presence of local experts, surgeons, who often doubled as inquisitors, or barbers, whose knives served dual duty. The body became not a vessel for existence, but a cartographic chart of sin. Every incision, every cauterization, every scarification was an annotated line item on the ledger of community moral failings. The scars we read about a nick beneath the earlobe for cheating at dice, a pattern across the palm denoting consanguinity to a criminal lineage, or a precise removal of lip tissue due to perceived slander. They illustrate a system that equated physical form with moral integrity. To be blemished was to be guilty. To be unmarked was merely suspected. The authorities rarely viewed this body modification as an act of cruelty in its own right, but rather as an act of necessary civic hygiene. If the community needed proof of social order, and if human memory was fickle or susceptible to denial, then the skin offered the only foolproof archival medium. The flesh became a kind of biosecurity system. And this brings us to the profound cultural misunderstanding that these markings were definitive proofs. They weren't merely documentation. They were treated as factual statements about the wearer's essential being. To look at a specific patch of hardened scar tissue was not just to observe damage, but to read a verdict. It was to understand, with chilling certainty, why this person would forever be relegated to a lower rank within the social geometry of their village. The consequences were elegantly comprehensive. The physical mark degraded one's economic standing and curtailed personal freedom. A man branded for debt could never truly accrue wealth because his very visible identity ensured he remained perpetually beholden to those who possessed the power of assessment. He was forever defined by the failing that had left him scarred. Consider the systemic implications of this visible self-correction. The law didn't just punish, it proactively redesigned its citizens, altering their epidermal reality to ensure compliance. It discouraged future malfeasance, not through the mere threat of pain, but through the absolute guarantee of lasting anatomical embarrassment. The scar is thus more than a souvenir of pain. It is a sophisticated piece of social engineering. It tells us that, in the medieval mind, boundaries, the lines separating crime from order, purity from taint, were best drawn with fire and blade, leaving behind indelible physical declarations. To be marked was to have accepted one's revised position within an unyielding, intensely curated communal narrative. The body itself became the ultimate instrument of social control, self-correcting, enduring proof that whispered judicial authority had successfully inscribed its judgment directly onto human nature. We have spent time examining the dramatic infrastructure of medieval justice, the burning pyres, the searing irons, the meticulously documented scars. We have analyzed how society built magnificent systems upon foundations of profound violence and deepest suspicion. Yet, if we peel back these layers of visible brutality, what remains is something far more delicate, far harder to capture in an archaeological dig or a forensic report. reputation. This chapter suggests that the most effective legal instrument was not the stake, nor even the brand shed. It was simply the word, the whispers, the oral transmission of gossip, the whisper network. Before the writ arrived from the magistrate's hand, before the trial by combat could be arranged on a muddy common ground, a person's fate often rested in the casual confidences exchanged over tankards of ale. In this era, truth was not measured against objective facts. It was measured against social consensus. And nothing is quite so potent an arbiter of truth as shared rumor. The accusations did not require proof of theft or heresy. They only required a compelling story that fit the prevailing anxieties of the community. A single suggestion, planted by one tongue in the relative safety of a tavern corner, could initiate a chain reaction that swept away lives far more effectively than any organized judicial process. Imagine a village where life was lived tightly woven, person to person, family to neighbor. In such a dense tapestry of existence, every transgression, every perceived slight, every mismanaged crop, every failure to properly greet the Lord on his passage was immediately registered and amplified. The ledger wasn't held by the chronicler. It resided in the collective memory of the community. And that memory, my friends, was fundamentally fallible. The gossip thus became a primary judicial tool. It was the informal, pre-trial inquiry. If someone began to whisper that the miller's flour tasted suspiciously coarse, or that the weaver's dyed cloth held an unsettling sheen, it did not wait for an official inspection. The rumor itself served as the preliminary finding of fact. Within weeks, before any court proceedings were even mandated, the accused was already socially condemned. They lived under a cloud of suspicion, diminished in market value, their standing reduced to that of someone who kept to themselves and never spoke their mind. This mechanism functioned because it tapped into deep human needs, the need for certainty and the desperate desire to maintain social equilibrium. When the world feels uncertain, when the harvest was poor, when the plague lingered just beyond the gate, when the feudal structure seemed shaky under political weight, the community desperately seeks a culprit. The whisper network provides that villain instantly. It gives them an enemy, and with an enemy comes temporary, comforting certainty. The consequences of this process were profound and devastating. A person could be ruined without ever setting foot in a courtroom. Their reputation, the accumulated currency of their personal standing, their social capital, was irrevocably damaged by proximity to suspicion. Once that trust was fractured by persistent, casual rumor, it was almost impossible to mend. The smear campaign, delivered through whispered anecdote, lingered longer and penetrated deeper than any formal judicial verdict. Consider the accusation of witchcraft. While we usually picture wild rituals involving cauldrons and broomsticks, the genesis of that suspicion often started with whispers concerning odd behavior. a woman who moved too late, a child whose cough was unusual, or knowledge gleaned from a book that was supposedly forbidden. The rumor supplied the evidence, the peculiar gait, the obscure plant name, and the community filled in the horrifying details themselves. Law enforcement merely provided the structure to formalize and execute what had already been decided through sheer collective fear. The courts operated within this unspoken agreement with the town square. They didn't create suspicion, they simply gave it a uniform and an authorized platform for public execution. The law, in its most chilling sense, became reactive rather than proactive. It served to validate the prevailing social anxieties. If people believed that speaking certain words too freely led to disaster, the legal system would ensure that those who spoke those words were swiftly silenced, often permanently. The genius and the terror of this system lie in its incredible efficiency. Physical torture was costly, difficult to execute systematically, and sometimes produced inconclusive results. The accusation fueled by gossip, however, was free, infinitely scalable, and required nothing more than proximity and a fear that could be easily exploited. It transformed social disagreement into life-altering judicial peril. This speaks to a profoundly modern understanding of justice through a medieval lens. The recognition of power dynamics inherent in information control. The ability to disseminate falsehoods, to simply make people believe something negative about a neighbor, and ensure that belief became shared common knowledge, was, for them, an almost irresistible force. It was social weaponization at its purest form. They understood that collective narrative held more tangible power than the crown's writ or the strength of the jailer's lock. The truly damning insight here is how quickly and effortlessly this system collapses back into comfortable anonymity. The accused could argue their innocence vigorously in a trial, presenting evidence of character or lineage. But they could never effectively counter the gravitational pull of collective suspicion that had already begun to form around them. Gossip did not require rebuttal. It merely required repetition. So we are left with this unnerving conclusion. While the high drama of medieval justice often tempts us with images of brutal spectacle, the screams, the flames, the iron, the quieter mechanism was arguably more lethal and structurally sound. The village rumor mill, the whisper network. It was here that abstract fear became concrete guilt, converting the intangible currency of trust into a definitive, deadly social record. And this realization makes us question not just how they lived, but how easily we ourselves are persuaded to believe what our closest neighbors are whispering in a hushed tone. It is tempting, when we view these historical practices through the lens of our modern ethical sensibilities, to assume that every agonizing procedure must be wrong. To judge the past requires us first to dispense with our own moral comfort, and instead ask a far stranger question. What did they believe? We have examined ordeals based on divine judgment, systems built upon the sting of public shame, and accusations fed by neighborly whispers. But history does not operate in discrete chapters of horror. It is a continuous flow, a desperate and paradoxical effort to maintain order. It was a system steeped in failure, violence, and profound uncertainty. Yet within that very messiness, we find something unsettling. Moments where the sheer brutality seemed to pave the way for something else. Moments where pain, by necessity, became its own strange form of preventative medicine. Consider those catastrophic systemic failures. The point was not merely punishment, it was control. When a legal structure, dependent on belief, the belief in divine intervention, the efficacy of hot iron, or the weight of the neighbor's accusation, stumbled, it didn't collapse entirely. Instead, its broken mechanisms were repurposed. If brandings could not eliminate debt, perhaps they would mark professions instead. If endless waiting failed to yield a confession, perhaps the legal process had to become more bureaucratic, more ritualized in its inefficiency. The first truth we must grapple with is this: these systems were profoundly adaptive. They did not just punish, they self-corrected through suffering. When one method of extraction, be it ordeal or interrogation, reached its limit of efficacy, the law did not invent a cleaner process immediately. It found a new mechanism that utilized existing tools of power and belief. Suffering became raw data. The failure was incorporated into the next iteration of the rule. And this leads us to the paradox at the heart of medieval justice, that sometimes humanity's most brutal necessity births its own uncomfortable form of progress. This is not an exoneration. It is a cold historical observation. It suggests that institutionalized cruelty, when faced with insufficient methods of control, was forced to refine those very cruelties into elaborate, stable structures. Think about the evolution from public humiliation, simply tied to simple debt, the pink pigments on the wrist for defaulting on taxes. This initial mechanism, designed merely to shame and signal economic failure, eventually required a more complex system of documentation. The shame became so formalized that it needed clerks, writs, and sealed documents. The physical stain gave way to the bureaucratic stain. The legal process shifted from the open square, where the pig was visible, to the sealed court chamber, where the scroll was authoritative. Similarly, the reliance on neighborly accusation proved too volatile for long-term governance. If guilt was merely consensus in a tavern, society would tear itself apart with every passing scandal. The law needed ways to stabilize that fluctuating social judgment. It began codifying suspicion. What started as casual gossip eventually necessitated formal accusations, requiring complex chains of evidence, however flimsy, and formalized judicial proceedings capable of surviving the ebb and flow of communal panic. The sheer necessity of ruling a large population, especially one whose beliefs were volatile and its economy prone to cyclical crisis, forced these legal structures into greater definition. A society built purely on whispers would devolve into anarchy. The need for predictable order meant that unpredictability, like unpredictable moral conscience, had to be systematically contained. We see this pattern repeated endlessly. When direct physical violence proved too exhausting or legally risky in certain instances, the power shifted toward indirect suffering. The protracted legal fight became the torture chamber. Not the branding iron, but the years spent appealing a decision, not the execution, but the inability to prove innocence, because the evidence was always elusive and contingent upon interpretation. The endurance of uncertainty itself became the ultimate punitive mechanism. Time, meticulously weaponized by the state, replaced pain as the primary means of social control. The paradox is this: these legal systems survived not because they were fundamentally fair or enlightened, but because their mechanisms for generating and containing fear proved to be astonishingly durable. The deep human need for predictability, when coupled with insufficient intellectual understanding of true justice, forced the creation of magnificent administrative cages. These cages had to be filled with rules, precedents, documentation, and ritual, all designed not necessarily to find truth, but simply to confirm the right people were in control. Therefore, when we examine these brutal frameworks today, we must view them not just as collections of barbaric punishments, but as sophisticated and deeply misguided engineering solutions. They represent humanity's initial, terrifying attempts at building a stable social contract using only fear and profoundly flawed metaphysical assumptions. The cruelty was sometimes the necessary lubricant for the gears of civilization to turn, proving that perhaps the most enduring force in human law is not the pursuit of truth, but simply the unyielding desire for structured continuation. We have spent this journey examining systems of control so profound they seem almost whimsical in their terrible thoroughness. From the stain of a pink pigment signifying debt to the searing geometry of an iron brand testifying to sin, we traced legal logic through centuries built on misunderstanding. We saw that for these people, law was not primarily about resolving conflict. It was about establishing consensus reality. It was a profound negotiation of belief, the inescapable truth running through every chapter, from the purity tested by boiling water to the accusation leveled across a dinner table, is that physical punishment or social shaming was rarely the ultimate goal. Those were merely visible manifestations, theatrical props used to validate an invisible framework of guilt and belonging. The real objective was always the reconstruction of order. And this brings us inevitably to our contemporary moment. We stand here, separated from those cobbled streets by millennia, insulated by layers of skepticism and empirical evidence. Our legal system, for all its recognized flaws, its biases, its systemic inequalities, is fundamentally built upon a modern premise: the primacy of individual rights and documented proof. Yet, when we look back at the medieval minds who conceived these ordeals, the methods of confession, the very architecture of suspicion that governed their lives, we are forced to confront a jarring question. What if our deepest intellectual assumptions about truth itself are simply elaborate cultural habits? We have analyzed systems that presumed divine intervention in courtrooms, and those that equated temporal endurance with spiritual cleansing. The sheer resilience of these deeply flawed structures is staggering, almost an act of pure cognitive persistence. It suggests a remarkable human capacity to build coherent belief systems, even when the inputs are utterly illogical from a modern perspective. Consider the foundational impulse, the need for certainty. In a world before universal literacy, before centralized records, before the comforting weight of academic doubt, uncertainty was not merely an intellectual state. It was an existential catastrophe. To live with ambiguity was to invite social collapse and spiritual damnation. Therefore, their jurisprudence developed powerful mechanisms, however brutal or absurd, whose sole function was to eliminate doubt. They did not seek justice in the modern sense of impartial fact-finding. They sought certainty, and certainty, for them, had a devastatingly predictable cost. The sophisticated nature of these methods often blinds us to their core simplicity. The complicated documentation of writs and dockets in Chapter 6 was not merely administration. It was theater designed to make the power structure appear inevitable, unchallengeable, and thus divinely ordained. The meticulous branding required by Chapter 7 was not just punishment. It was a way of making social failure materially permanent, a biography written in scar tissue that could never be erased by time or repentance. The most chilling insight we can draw from these remnants of law is this: belief systems, when they become the foundation of power, do not respond to objective truth. They respond to internal coherence. If a ritual validates the authority of the court and reaffirms the social hierarchy, if it allows the king or the local magistrate to maintain control over the populace's narrative, then that ritual, no matter how much agony it required, was deemed rationally necessary. The suffering was not the punishment. It was the proof of the system's own enduring self-justification. How often do we perform this same act in our modern lives? We mistake complex belief for intrinsic truth. We accept convenient narratives, be they political, economic, or personal, not because we have scrutinized every piece of evidence presented to us, but because questioning The narrative requires too much exhausting effort. The weight of collective consensus has an inertia that rivals any medieval judicial decree. It is far easier and safer simply to assume the truth offered by the loudest voices. The dark humor of this entire examination lies in recognizing our own profound susceptibility. We laugh at the pink pigments. We marvel at the absurdity of passing judgment over a cup of spiced wine, but beneath that gentle academic amusement stirs a cold recognition. We are still governed by powerful narratives of belief. We have merely traded the spectacle of heated iron for the equally compelling, yet far more diffuse, theater of media consensus. The stakes remain profoundly high. The mechanism of collective agreement remains tragically effective. And perhaps in accepting this modern coziness, the comfortable certainty of our own civilization, we risk developing a new kind of institutional blindness, forgetting that sometimes the most deeply held certainties are simply elaborate